The gold-plated doors of the Grand Marble Hotel swung open, and for a second the entire world seemed to stop spinning. The air inside the ballroom smelled like expensive lilies and vintage champagne. I took a deep breath, smoothing the silk of my custom-designed gown. It was a deep midnight blue, the color of a storm at sea. Every head in the room turned. I could hear the collective gasp of the elite crowd, but I only had eyes for one person. Lucan was standing on the stage, a crystal glass held high in his hand. He was mid-toast, laughing at something a business partner had said. Then his eyes met mine. The laughter died instantly. His hand trembled and the champagne sloshed over the rim of his glass, dripping onto his expensive suit. His jaw went slack and his face turned a ghostly shade of white. He looked like he was seeing a ghost, and in a way he was. To him, I was Priya, the woman who had vanished into the shadows years ago. Next to him, his new wife, Isolde, stumbled backward. She was dripping in diamonds that probably cost more than a small mansion, but she looked terrified. "Priya, how?" she stammered, her voice cracking through the sudden silence of the room. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. I just stood there, poised and powerful, letting the weight of my presence crush their confidence. My name is Priya, and I was supposed to be dead to him. I walked slowly down the center aisle, the clicking of my heels sounding like a countdown. 5 years ago, I had walked out of a similar room with nothing but the clothes on my back and a broken heart. Today, I was walking back in as the person who held their entire future in my hands. The silence was heavy, filled with the ghosts of every cold word and every humiliation Lucan had ever thrown at me. I saw the moment realization hit him. He wasn't just seeing an ex-wife, he was seeing his replacement. The empire he thought he ruled was no longer his. I had built a fortress while he was busy playing king, and now the true owner had arrived to claim the throne. The memory of the night I left was burned into my mind like a scar. It was raining, a cold, biting rain that soaked through my thin coat. I stood on the sidewalk, watching the red taillights of Lucan's limousine fade into the darkness. He hadn't even looked back. Earlier that evening, he had looked me in the eye and told me I wasn't strong enough for his world. He said I was a liability, a girl from a simple background who didn't understand the shark-infested waters of high society. He didn't just leave me, he erased me. Within weeks, he had used his influence to distance my own family from me. They were lured by his wealth and terrified of his power. My name was smeared in whispers across every country club and boardroom. They called me unstable. They said I had gone away for my own good. Lucan married Isolde, a wealthy heiress, barely a month after I vanished. He told the world I was out of the picture, as if I were a piece of trash he had finally thrown away. I spent those first few months in a tiny, one-bedroom apartment that smelled like damp wood and old dreams. I cried until I had no tears left, but then something shifted inside me. The sadness turned into a cold, hard lump of coal, and then it turned into fire. I realized that Lucan's greatest mistake wasn't betraying me. It was leaving me alive with a brain he had always underestimated. I vowed, silently, that I would return. I wouldn't return as a victim seeking an apology. I would return as a force of nature that he couldn't ignore. I started with almost nothing. The only thing Lucan couldn't touch was a small inheritance my grandmother had left me in a private trust. It wasn't billionaire money, but it was enough to be a seed. I spent my days in the public library, teaching myself the language of the stock market. I read books on corporate law, international trade, and psychological warfare in business. I realized that Lucan's empire was built on confidence, but my empire would be built on cold, hard facts. I began taking calculated risks. I didn't go for the flashy tech stocks that everyone else was chasing. Instead, I looked for undervalued companies, the boring ones that provided the steel, the logistics, and the infrastructure that the big players needed to survive. I networked under a different name, using a small consulting firm I created as a front. Every win I had, no matter how small, was poured back into the business. I lived on coffee and ambition, working 18 hours a day while the world thought I was a memory. There were days when I lost money. There were nights when I wondered if I was delusional. But every loss taught me a lesson about how the market breathed. Every setback became fuel for my fire. I learned that the wealthy are often blinded by their own arrogance. They assume that because they have money today, they will always have it tomorrow. I used that arrogance against them. I started buying up debt, specifically the debt of companies that Lucan's firm relied on. I was building a web, and he was the fly who didn't even know he was being hunted yet. In my 3rd year of rebuilding, I met a man who would change everything. His name was Evander. He was a retired tycoon who had once been more powerful than Lucan could ever dream of being. He had a reputation for having a killer instinct in the boardroom, but he had retreated from public life after a personal tragedy. I tracked him down to a quiet garden in the countryside. He didn't want to talk at first, but I didn't ask for money. I asked for his time. I told him my story, not the emotional version, but the strategic one. I showed him my portfolio and my plan to dismantle Lucan's influence. Evander watched me with sharp, gray eyes. He saw the potential in me, but he also saw the danger. Revenge is a two-edged sword, Priya, he warned me. If you do this with anger, you will fail, but if you do this with precision, you will win. Revenge must be precise, clean, and dignified. Never let them see you sweat. Under Evander's mentorship, I stopped being a gambler and started being a grandmaster. He taught me the inner workings of the industries Lucan flaunted. He showed me how to read the white space in contracts and how to find the hidden vulnerabilities in a CEO's ego. He became the advisor I never had, the person who believed in me when my own blood had turned their backs. With Evander's guidance, I began to form alliances with other outsiders, mentors and insiders who had been burned by men like Lucan. We were an army of shadows, and we were ready to step into the light. By the 4th year, I was no longer the broken girl who had been cast aside. I had a new identity, a new face in the business world, and a new mask. I began attending high society events that Lucan frequented, but I did it carefully. I used a different name and wore outfits that were elegant but didn't scream for attention. I stayed in the corners, watching him. Lucan was always the loudest person in the room. He was proud, arrogant, and clearly felt he was untouchable. I watched the way he treated people. He hadn't changed. He still looked down on anyone he deemed lesser. He would laugh at his own jokes and talk over anyone who tried to offer a different opinion. I took notes on everything, who he talked to, which banks he trusted, and which board members seemed frustrated with his leadership. I was a predator observing its prey in its natural habitat. One night, at a fundraiser for an arts museum, I stood just a few feet away from him. He was bragging about a new merger. He looked right at me, but he didn't see me. He saw a polished, professional woman who belonged in that room. He didn't recognize the eyes of the woman he had abandoned. It was a strange feeling, partly painful, but mostly empowering. He was so caught up in his own greatness that he couldn't see the threat standing right in front of him. That was the moment I knew my plan was working. The social mask was perfect. Isolde, Lucan's new wife, was just as arrogant as he was. She loved to flaunt her influence. She decided to throw a massive investor appreciation party to show off her status as the new queen of the social scene. It was the perfect opportunity. I managed to get myself invited as a representative for a private investment group, a group that, unbeknownst to her, I actually controlled. The party was gaudy, filled with over-the-top decorations and people trying too hard to impress one another. Isolde moved through the crowd like she owned the air they breathed. I watched her as she bragged to a group of socialites about Lucan's absolute control over the company. "Lucan has the final say in everything," she said with a smug smile. "Nobody moves a muscle in this industry without his permission." I stood nearby, sipping a glass of mineral water, and smiled silently to myself. While she was busy bragging about her husband's control, I was busy signing the final papers to own the majority shares of their primary supplier in private. I was the one who actually held the power now, but I let her keep her delusions. It was like watching a child play with a toy they didn't realize was already broken. I let her have her moment of glory, knowing that every word she spoke was making her eventual fall even more spectacular. The first real crack in Lucan's armor happened in a place he felt most comfortable, the boardroom. I had managed to acquire enough influence to sit in on a high-level meeting regarding a new development project. Lucan walked in late, as usual, tossing his leather briefcase onto the mahogany table. He didn't even look at the faces of the people sitting there. He just started barking orders about how the project was going to proceed. When he finally noticed me, he scoffed. He didn't recognize me as Priya. My hair was different, my style was sharper, and I carried myself with an authority he couldn't fathom. He just saw a woman he thought was a junior analyst or a guest. "Who let the gallery in?" he asked, gesturing toward me with a dismissive wave. "This is a meeting for owners, not observers." I didn't flinch. I reached into my folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a copy of a contract signed months ago, proving that my firm had acquired the land rights for the very project he was trying to lead. I slid the paper across the table toward him. "Actually, Lucan," I said, my voice steady and cold, "I think you'll find that you are the one observing. This project doesn't move forward without my signature." He blinked, looking at the paper. For a split second, I saw it, the first tiny flash of disbelief and confusion creeping into his eyes. He didn't understand how a stranger had outmaneuvered him, and he certainly didn't know the stranger was me. As I moved deeper into Lucan's world, I started picking up the whispers of his family. His sister, Billionaire, was the worst of the bunch. She had always been cruel to me when I was married to Lucan, treating me like a servant who had somehow lucked into a palace. I happened to be at a high-end spa when I overheard her talking in the lounge area. She didn't know I was in the next booth, hidden by a silk curtain. Billionaire was plotting with one of her friends to ruin the reputation of a new player in the market, me. She didn't know it was me, but she knew someone was making moves against Lucan, and she wanted to crush the insect before it got too close. She spoke about using fake news and social media leaks to smear my firm. Her voice was full of that same old venom I remembered so well. Instead of getting angry, I smiled. Information is the most valuable currency in the world. I let the eavesdropping become my ultimate advantage. I didn't stop her. I let her continue her scheme. But I quietly leaked the wrong information to her sources. I made sure that every move she made to ruin me actually ended up exposing her own shady business dealings. By the time she realized she was being played, she had already embarrassed herself in front of the very people she was trying to impress. I turned their own schemes against them without ever having to raise my voice. The tension continued to build at a major charity gala. This was Lucan's home turf, an event where he could boast about his wealth and generosity to the world. He was on stage, announcing a large donation to a local hospital, soaking up the applause like a dry sponge. He looked so confident, so sure that he was the most important person in the room. I was there too, but I stayed in the shadows of the balcony. I didn't want a public confrontation yet. I wanted a strategic victory. When it came time for the anonymous portion of the auction, I placed a bid that was triple what Lucan had donated. I didn't use my name, but the board members of the charity, the same people who sat on the boards of Lucan's companies, knew exactly where the money was coming from. I watched Lucan from across the room. He was trying to figure out who had outshone him. His confident smile started to waver. He started looking around the room, his eyes scanning the faces of his peers. He could feel the tide turning. People who used to flock to him were now whispering to each other, looking toward the mysterious, anonymous donor. His foundation was built on being the biggest fish in the pond. Now that a bigger fish had appeared, his confidence was beginning to crumble. The real blow came when I moved to take over his top venture. It was a tech manufacturing company that was the jewel of his crown. He had poured millions into it, assuming it would make him a trillionaire. He didn't realize that I had been quietly buying up the majority stake through various shell companies over the last year. When the deal was finally closed, I had the legal notice delivered directly to his office. My assistant told me that when Lucan received the notice, he actually laughed. He threw the papers on his desk and told his secretary it was a pathetic bluff from some small-time investor who wanted attention. He was so blinded by his own arrogance that he couldn't even process the possibility that he had lost control of his favorite project. I didn't do anything to explain. I didn't call him, and I didn't send another letter. I just let him sit in his office and laugh. I knew that in 48 hours, the banks would freeze his access to the company's accounts. I let his own pride fuel my satisfaction. It was like watching someone walk toward a cliff while they were busy looking at their own reflection in a mirror. He was so sure he was winning that he didn't even notice the ground disappearing beneath his feet. The atmosphere changed the moment Isolde discovered who I really was. A mutual acquaintance, someone who had known me back when I was the meek Priya, spotted me at a high-end boutique. The word got back to Isolde within hours. Her world, which she thought was built on solid rock, suddenly turned into quicksand. Her charm, which she used like a weapon, turned into pure panic. She tried to be strategic. She tried to reach out to her old contacts to handle me, but she found that many of them were already working with me. Her strategies failed because she didn't realize I wasn't the same girl Lucan had kicked out. I wasn't looking for a place at their table. I was looking to take the table away. I watched from a distance as her attempts to manipulate Lucan backfired. She tried to warn him, but because she was panicking, he just saw her as being hysterical. He had spent so long looking down on women that he couldn't even listen to his own wife when she told him the truth. He dismissed her fears, which only made her more desperate. The house of cards they had built together was starting to shake, and I was just getting started. I decided to turn up the heat just a little bit. I leaked a subtle hint to a major business magazine. I didn't give them my name, but I gave them enough information to write a story about a mysterious investor who was reshaping Lucan's empire from the inside out. The article was a masterpiece of suspense. It highlighted every move I had made without revealing the face behind the curtain. When the magazine hit the stands, Lucan grew paranoid. He couldn't sleep. He started suspecting everyone in his inner circle of betrayal. He fired 3 of his most loyal assistants because he thought they were the moles giving me information. He was tearing his own team apart from the inside, doing my work for me. I watched him at a distance. He looked tired. The smugness was gone, replaced by a twitchy, nervous energy. He was looking over his shoulder at every meeting, wondering who was really on his side. He was living in the world he had created, a world of lies and manipulation, and now he was the one who couldn't trust the air he breathed. I was in plain sight, but to him, I was a ghost haunting his every move. I attended another gala shortly after the magazine article was published, but this time, I wore a slight disguise, a mask for a masquerade-themed event. Lucan was there, trying to maintain appearances. He was flirting with potential business partners, trying to convince them that he was still in control. He didn't know I was standing just 5 feet away from him, listening to every word. I could see the cracks forming in his network of allies. The people he was talking to weren't looking at him with respect anymore. They were looking at him with pity. They had read the news. They knew someone was eating his lunch, and they didn't want to be on the sinking ship with him. One of his long-term partners leaned in and whispered, "Lucan, are you sure you've got this covered? This new investor seems to know your business better than you do." Lucan's face turned red, and he snapped at the man. That was his biggest mistake. In high society, losing your cool is like admitting defeat. I watched as the partner walked away, shaking his head. Lucan was alone in a room full of people, and I was the one holding the light. Evander called me into his study one evening. He had a folder on his desk that contained the holy grail of information. He had used his old connections to find out the details of Lucan's next major deal, a massive merger that Lucan was counting on to save his reputation. It was a high-risk, high-reward move that required a massive amount of liquid cash. "He's desperate, Priya," Evander said. "He's overextending himself. If this deal fails, he loses everything." I looked at the numbers. It was a bold move, but it was also a reckless one. Lucan was betting the foundation of his company on a single project. I used that insider knowledge to legally undermine him. I didn't break any laws. I just moved faster. I quietly acquired the smaller assets and logistical firms that the merger required to function. By the time Lucan was ready to sign the final papers, he realized that the package he was buying was empty. I had already bought the pieces he needed. I didn't even have to act, I just had to be there first. The next board meeting was a high-stakes showdown. Lucan walked in, trying to look like the man in charge, but the atmosphere in the room was cold. I sat at the far end of the table, my identity still not fully revealed to the entire board. I waited for the perfect moment. When Lucan tried to call for a vote on his new merger, I raised my hand. "Before we vote," I said, "I think the board should be aware of some subtle changes in the voting rights." I presented the documents showing that my firm now held the majority of the preferred shares. Lucan's face went from pale to purple. He tried to regain control, shouting that the documents were fake, but the board members were already looking at them with interest. They could see the power slipping away from him chapter by chapter. He was no longer the leader. He was just a man with a loud voice. I sat back and watched as the board members began to turn their chairs toward me. The tide hadn't just turned, it had completely shifted. Isolde tried one last, desperate move. She approached me secretly at a coffee shop, away from the prying eyes of their social circle. She wasn't the arrogant heiress anymore. She looked haggard and scared. She offered me a massive bribe, millions of dollars, to keep my identity hidden and to stop my attack on Lucan's company. "You can have the money and go away," she pleaded. "Just leave us alone. We can make you rich." I looked at her, and for a second I felt a flicker of pity. But then I remembered the way she had looked at me when Lucan abandoned me. I remembered how she had helped him smear my name. I didn't take the money. Instead, I stayed silent and let my phone record the entire conversation. I didn't need her money. I had my own. What I needed was leverage. I told her, "I'm not here for money, Isolde. I'm here for what's mine." I walked away, leaving her sitting there with her useless millions. I now had proof of her attempt to bribe an investor, and I knew exactly when to use it. The countdown to the annual gala began. This was the event where Lucan usually reigned supreme. He spent weeks planning it, thinking it would be his grand comeback. He didn't know that I had already become the key sponsor through an anonymous foundation. I was the one who approved the guest list. I was the one who chose the caterers. I was even the one who decided the seating arrangements. I placed Lucan and Isolde at a table that was technically honored, but it was positioned in a way that every camera in the room would have a clear shot of their reactions when I made my entrance. I made sure the media coverage was going to be intense. I invited the top business journalists and social columnists, promising them a story of the decade. Lucan thought he was hosting a party for himself. He didn't realize he was actually the guest of honor at his own funeral. Everything was under my control, down to the last flower on the tables. A few days before the gala, I decided to release one more piece of the puzzle. I anonymously leaked evidence of Lucan's questionable financial practices to the press. These weren't just rumors. They were documented facts about how he had manipulated funds to cover his recent losses. Panic spread among his remaining allies like a wildfire. His stock price plummeted. People who had been his friends for 20 years were suddenly unavailable for lunch. The foundation of his public image, which he had spent his whole life building, was cracking wide open. He tried to issue a statement, but nobody was listening. The mysterious investor was the only person people wanted to talk about. He was becoming a joke in the very world where he used to be a king. I watched the news reports from my office, feeling a sense of calm. The trap was set, and the bait had been taken. Lucan finally snapped. He managed to find out where I was staying and showed up at my private residence, demanding to see me. I didn't hide. I let him in. He looked terrible. His suit was wrinkled, and there was a desperate look in his eyes. "What do you want, Priya?" he screamed. "Why are you doing this? I gave you everything." I stayed perfectly calm, sitting in a velvet armchair. "You didn't give me everything, Lucan," I said quietly. "You gave me a reason to find out who I really was. You betrayed me, you lied about me, and you tried to destroy me. I'm just returning the favor." He realized for the first time that I wasn't the woman he could bully or manipulate anymore. I was untouchable. He tried to apologize, but it was too late and too hollow. I watched him realize that he had no cards left to play. He left my house looking smaller than I had ever seen him. The confrontation was over, but the finale was just beginning. The day of the gala arrived. I spent the afternoon finalizing every detail. This was the stage I had been building for 5 years. Every ally I had made, every competitor Lucan had stepped on, and every member of the social elite would be there to witness the truth. I knew that Lucan's downfall had to be public. It had to be elegant, and it had to be irreversible. If I just took his money, he could always make more. But if I took his reputation and his dignity in front of everyone he cared about, he would never recover. I looked at myself in the mirror. I didn't see the broken girl from the rain anymore. I saw a woman who had built an empire from the ashes of her own life. I was ready. The gala was no longer a party. It was a courtroom, and I was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. The grand staircase of the Marble Hotel felt like a runway to my new life. As I began my descent, the roar of the crowd died down to a whisper. The mysterious owner was finally appearing. I could see Lucan in the center of the room. His expression shifted from a practiced smugness to a look of frozen terror. The cameras started flashing, 100 tiny explosions of light. I didn't blink. I walked with a grace that I had practiced for years. Every eye in the room followed me. I wasn't the weak girl they remembered. I was the owner. I was the victor. I reached the bottom of the stairs and walked straight toward Lucan. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. I stood in front of him, and for the first time in my life, I was the one looking down on him. The silence was absolute. "Hello, Lucan," I said, my voice carrying through the room. "I believe you're in my seat." Isolde tried to step in, her voice shrill as she tried to claim her status. "This is our event," she cried out to the journalists. "You have no right to be here." I didn't even look at her. I simply signaled to my legal team, who stepped forward with the documents. "Actually," one of my lawyers said, "Ms. Priya holds the majority shares of the host corporation. She is technically the owner of this building, this event, and the company your husband is currently struggling to lead." Isolde's face crumbled. She panicked right in front of the media, her arrogance backfiring spectacularly as she began to babble excuses. Lucan couldn't even speak. He just stood there, watching as his wife made a fool of herself, and as the world realized he was no longer the man in charge. He was a spectator in his own life. The cameras captured every second of his humiliation. I didn't stop at the social victory. I called an emergency board meeting right there in a private room at the gala. The board members, who were already present as guests, were forced to attend. They were tired of Lucan's failures and were impressed by my strategic takeover. Under the pressure of the shareholders and the evidence I had gathered, Lucan was forced to sign over control of his remaining assets. He had no choice. The banks had already pulled their support. He signed the papers with a shaking hand, his empire crumbling quietly but publicly. When he walked out of that room, he wasn't a billionaire anymore. He was just a man who had lost everything because he thought he was better than everyone else. I watched him go, not with hatred, but with a deep sense of peace. The job was done. The fallout for Lucan's family was immediate. His sister Theana and the rest of his relatives suddenly found themselves without the unlimited bank account they had been using for years. I watched as their alliances fractured and their egos collapsed. They tried to come to me for help, but I didn't give them a cent. I didn't use violence, and I didn't use insults. I just used dignity and strategy. I showed them the same coldness they had shown me when I was at my weakest. They realized, too late, that their favoritism and arrogance had enabled Lucan's fall. They were left to figure out how to live in a world where their name no longer carried any weight. It was a clean break, and it was final. The story ended not with a bang, but with a celebration of a new beginning. I hosted a private dinner with Evander, my new business partners, and the friends who had actually stood by me. We sat on the balcony of my new penthouse, looking out over the city. I reflected on the journey. I had learned that revenge is sweetest when it doesn't come from a place of anger, but from a place of self-respect and power. I had rebuilt my life from strength, and I had done it on my own terms. Lucan and Isolde faded into obscurity, their names eventually becoming a footnote in the business world. My empire was thriving, my dignity was untouchable, and for the first time in 5 years, I was truly free. I was no longer the girl who was supposed to be dead. I was the woman who was finally, truly alive.